The night my parents sold me, I didn't understand what was happening. I was only 6. I remember my mother's trembling hands, my father's stern expression, and the stranger's cold, calculating gaze as he pulled out a thick envelope of cash. Then, in a single moment, I was no longer their child. I was a transaction. I was taken to a house that was unfamiliar, stripped of my name, and forced into a life I never chose. No school, no play, just silence and obedience. The people who bought me didn't see me as a child. They saw me as property. I became a servant, working tirelessly in a home that was never mine. Days turned into years, and I learned one cruel truth. No one was coming to save me, but I never stopped dreaming of escape. I watched, I listened, I planned, and one night when the doors creaked just right, when the lights were dim enough, I ran. I never looked back. Life on the streets wasn't easy, but it was mine. I hustled, I survived, and eventually I built a name for myself. I worked hard, educated myself, and against all odds, I became something my parents never expected. Powerful. And then one day, out of nowhere, they came back. Not with apologies, not with regret, but with desperation, begging for my help. I stared at the parents who had once thrown me away, their voices shaking as they pleaded. Should I forgive them, or should I let them suffer the way they left me to suffer? For years, I refused to let my past define me. I had been thrown away like an object, but I was determined to prove that I was more than someone's forgotten mistake. The streets became my first teacher, teaching me survival, resilience, and the brutal truth that no one would ever fight for me unless I fought for myself. I worked tirelessly, taking every odd job I could find, cleaning floors, carrying boxes, learning skills. I kept my head down and pushed forward, but as the years passed, I became more than just a survivor. I became someone powerful. By the time I was in my 20s, I had built something of my own. A career, a name, a life. Everything my parents thought I'd never have. And just when I thought I had finally buried my past, they appeared again. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I was in my office, an office that was mine, built from nothing, when the front desk called to inform me of unexpected visitors. I almost laughed when I heard their names. My parents. They sat in the waiting area, looking nothing like the people I remembered. They were older now, their expensive clothes doing little to hide their exhaustion. Their hands clutched one another tightly, and their eyes darted around the room, unsure, anxious. I stood behind the glass wall watching them. They had once sold me without hesitation, yet here they were, begging for my help. But what could have driven them to this? I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The moment they looked up and saw me, their faces went pale. They weren't just here for help. They were here because they had no one else left. My parents sat in front of me, their hands trembling, their faces lined with worry. They had aged since the last time I saw them, not just physically, but in a way that told me they had been through something they didn't know how to fix. For a moment, no one spoke. They shifted uncomfortably under my gaze, avoiding my eyes like they knew they had no right to look at me. I let the silence stretch, let them sit in their shame. Then my father finally cleared his throat. His voice was hoarse, weaker than I remembered. We need your help." I leaned back, arms crossed. "Interesting," I said, keeping my voice calm. "You needed help when I was 6 too. That's why you sold me, right?" My mother winced, gripping the armrest of her chair. "It wasn't like that. I raised a hand. Don't tell me it wasn't like that. I remember everything." Their desperation was obvious, but I wasn't going to make this easy for them. "So tell me," I said, tilting my head, "what could possibly be so bad that you'd come to me? The son you abandoned." My father swallowed hard. "We lost everything." Everything. The word hung between us, but it didn't feel like enough, not compared to what they had taken from me. "We had a business," my mother added. "It was thriving, but there were bad investments, the wrong people, and now they're coming after us." I narrowed my eyes. The wrong people? So this wasn't just about money. Someone was after them, someone dangerous. And now, after all these years, they had nowhere else to turn. But why should I save the people who once sold me? I leaned forward, studying the two people who had once chosen money over me. Now, after all these years, they were the ones left with nothing, and somehow they expected me to save them. I should have laughed. I should have stood up and walked out. But something about the way my mother's hands shook made me hesitate. I folded my arms. "Who's after you?" My father's jaw tightened. "It's complicated." I let out a slow breath, my patience thinning. "Try me." My mother glanced at him nervously before whispering, "We borrowed money." "A lot of it." She swallowed hard. "From the wrong people." I didn't blink. "Mafia?" They didn't deny it. A bitter smile tugged at my lips. This was better than anything I could have imagined. The people who had once sold me for a quick payday were now being hunted over money they couldn't repay. My father rubbed his temples. "We tried to fix it, but everything fell apart. They're threatening to take our house, to take everything." For a moment I said nothing. I wanted them to feel the fear, the helplessness, the worthlessness I had felt when they threw me away. But then something shifted. My instincts kicked in. I wasn't a helpless child anymore. I was powerful now, powerful enough to make a choice, help them, or let them drown. Before I could decide, my office phone rang. The receptionist's voice was shaky. "Sir, there's someone here to see you. He says he's from the group your parents owe money to." My pulse spiked. They had found them, and now they had found me too. I stood frozen for a moment, my grip tightening around the edge of my desk. The receptionist's voice echoed in my head. They had found them, and now they had found me. I glanced at my parents, their faces drained of color. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her breath shallow. My father's fingers twitched against his knee, his usual arrogance stripped away by raw fear. So this is what it felt like. The terror of knowing your fate wasn't in your hands. I wanted to savor it, to let them drown in it. But there was no time for that now. I straightened, forcing my voice to remain calm. "Send him in." My mother gasped. "No, you can't." I held up a hand. "Enough. You dragged me into this. Now let me handle it." Seconds later, the office door opened and a man walked in. Dark suit, cold eyes, a presence that sucked the air from the room. He didn't need to introduce himself. I knew exactly who he was. He took one look at my parents, then turned his gaze to me. A slow, knowing smile crept onto his face. "So," he said, his voice smooth, almost amused, "you're the one they ran to." I didn't blink. "Looks like it." He nodded, glancing around. "Impressive. You did well for yourself. Much better than they did." The insult stung my parents, but I remained unreadable. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to make my skin prickle. "Here's the thing," he said. "I don't want their money anymore." I clenched my jaw. "Then what do you want?" His smile widened. "I want you." The air in the office felt heavier, charged with unspoken tension. The man's words lingered in my ears. "I want you." I stared at him, unreadable. My parents stiffened beside me, their eyes darting between us, desperate, helpless. For the first time in their lives, they had no power. I leaned back in my chair, forcing my voice to remain calm. "And if I say no?" The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Then they die." My mother let out a strangled sob, gripping my father's arm. My father clenched his fist but said nothing. He knew better. I exhaled slowly. I had been preparing for this moment without even realizing it. Years of struggle, of learning to outthink, outmaneuver, outlast. I had built something from nothing, and now they wanted to take it from me? Number not this time. I glanced at my desk. A small red button, installed months ago, sat underneath. Silent. Hidden. Connected directly to a security team I personally hired for situations exactly like this. I met the man's gaze, holding it steady. "Fine," I said, "but let me make a counteroffer." He raised an eyebrow, amused. "Go on." I smiled. "How about you walk out of here now, and I don't ruin your entire operation?" His smirk faltered. A knock on the door, then another. My security team. armed, ready. The man stiffened, realizing too late. I had played him at his own game. I leaned forward, voice dangerously low. You think I built all this without knowing how to protect it? His jaw clenched. The power had shifted. Leave, I said, and take your debt with you. The hunter had become the hunted. The man's face darkened, his arrogance slipping as the realization sank in. He had lost. The power he thought he held over me, over my parents, was gone. He glanced at the door, at the shadows of armed security waiting just beyond it. Without a word, he stood, adjusted his suit, forced a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. This isn't over, he muttered. I tilted my head. Oh, it is. And next time, make sure the person you're threatening isn't 10 steps ahead of you. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing as he walked out. Just like that, the nightmare my parents had created for themselves was over. The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother let out a shaky breath, burying her face in her hands. My father, for once in his life, looked small, defeated. I stood, walking to the window, staring out at the city I had built my life in, a life they had no part in. After a moment, my father spoke. Thank you? I turned, meeting his tired gaze. The man who had once thrown me away now sat before me, stripped of all power. He wasn't asking for help anymore. He was acknowledging that he no longer had control over me. I exhaled, feeling something unexpected. Relief, not for them, but for myself. I didn't do it for you, I said simply. I did it because I refused to be like you. They looked at me, searching for something. Redemption, forgiveness. I had neither to give. I turned away. You should go. They hesitated but didn't argue. They knew better now. As they walked out, I sat back down, staring at my reflection in the glass. I was never theirs to sell, and I would never be theirs to own again. The past no longer had power over me. That was the real victory. The end.